All right. Thank you so much. Boy, this might be a little loud. I don't know where the volume for this is. Do you know the volume? Is it? It's okay? Okay, we'll say it's okay. All right. So thank you so much for having me here today. In this talk, I'm going to kind of just wander all over the place. I'm not going to get into any details in anything. So if there's something that you're really curious about and excited about, feel free to come talk to me afterwards. But as I was preparing this talk, I got thinking, what are my major interests? And to kind of use this example, if we imagine the ocean as the physical world and the sky as the digital world, I would say what I'm really interested in is this point right here, where these two things meet. And there's times I'd say in my work, I end up kind of wandering up here in this digital world and less kind of farther away from the physical world, and I do probably much less of this. But it's this point where these two things interface that I think I get really excited about. And a lot of this comes from 20 years ago, I was an undergrad here. I got my bachelor's of science in computer engineering, and was designing computational hardware, but it wasn't really quite right for me. And so I ended up going to grad school, and I went to UC Irvine and got in this very weird program called Arts Computation Engineering. And the idea here is we're going to take artists and computer scientists and engineers, we're going to slam them together, and we're going to do weird stuff. So some of my colleagues built robots controlled by cockroaches. And the thing I got to work on was a project, so it was me, an artist, another engineer who's been at Apple and Meta, and we built little tiny backpacks for pigeons. And these backpacks contained pollution sensors and GPS, and the goal was that these pigeons would now fly around Southern California, and they would collect this pollution data, and then we'd real-time map it on Google Maps, and we could monitor pollution in areas that no one had ever seen. This was a project that, quite honestly, the press thought was hilarious. We got in all kinds of news. I got to be on National Evening News with Katie Couric. I was labeled graduate student. I didn't get my name on there. But a lot of my work then personally really revolved around this idea of what happens when we have this interface between the virtual and the real. And so I was building different devices where you'd have little tiny remote control cars, and the virtual environment would affect the cars, and the cars would affect the virtual environment. And you have this kind of interesting interplay between these two things. And this work continued when I went to San Diego, in which I got to work on kind of really large-scale visualization systems. So for a while, we had the highest resolution display on the planet. And I was working on different ways of creating multi-touch tables and different devices, and how do we interface with these things, and got myself involved with another group. So this is the Center for Architecture and Archaeology. And here we were trying to use digital tools to try to find a lost Da Vinci painting. So the thought was that this painting here you see on, this is a cartoon of it, that it's behind this wall in this museum in Florence, Italy. So this project was funded by National Geographic. They kind of own the rights to it. They did a special a little over 10 years ago. It's got kind of an unfulfilling conclusion. I got to work on another National Geographic project where we were trying to find the lost tomb of Genghis Khan. So this is me, much younger me, when we were trying to do these type of displays. The other thing we were doing in San Diego is we were building these different types of VR displays. So this is one we call the Star Cave. So it's kind of, as opposed to a traditional 6-sided cave, it's 5 sides and using different types of TV devices. And this all led me back to when I came back here to Wisconsin in terms of different types of projects we could work on. So when I came back, I started working with Patty Brennan, who used to be faculty in this department. And Patty had done this project called Project Health Design. And what her goal was to go and put technology in people's homes. So they wanted to put tablets, devices, and monitor people's health. And as they did this, they realized, you know what, we don't really understand the context of the home environment and how it's affecting people. Because oftentimes when we think about health and healthcare, we think about rooms like this. We think about hospitals and operating rooms, and these rooms are nice, they're neat, they're organized. When we look at people's home environments, they oftentimes look like this. They're cluttered, they're chaotic, but people somehow are monitoring their health and doing their health perfectly fine in these environments. And we have no idea how. How are they monitoring their health there? So the concept was, could we build a virtual reality device? So this is a cave system we have still over at WID. So this is a room, the floor, the walls, the ceilings are all 3D projections. So could we use this device, take people into virtual reality, take them to people's homes, and use it to try to study the way the home is affecting them to generate different types of medical procedures and devices. And so this is me in our cave environment about 10 years ago. So I'm there. Everything else you see are 3D projections projected on these walls. I still think this is kind of cool, but there's obviously lots of things that are not very realistic with it. So let me pull out one of them to start, which is, if our goal is to simulate these cluttered and chaotic environments, this environment doesn't look very cluttered and chaotic, right? This environment looks very simple, kind of cartoonish, very computer generated. So if I want to take a real environment, how do I go and put it in the virtual world, right? And what's interesting, and as someone who's currently going through a home remodel process, I can attest that this is still what happens today, is that we go and we send somebody out there and they make a bunch of measurements. They measure the whole space, then they take these measurements, they put it into a 3D modeling software, and they generate a 3D model. And it's pretty good for walls and floors and ceilings. But if we have an environment like this, right, like this tape measure approach isn't going to work. And so what we did is we turned to a technology called LiDAR. So this stands for light detection and ranging. And the general idea here is that we're going to use basically a laser meter like you get at a hardware store. It tells you how far away something is. And then the scanner is going to spin around in a circle, and the scanner knows what angle it's at and knows the distance of something, so it can position 3D points out in space. And from this, we're going to generate a 3D model. And these 3D models we call point clouds. So sometimes it gets a little confusing to people because they think of points and clouds, and they think about cloud computing. And this term point cloud has nothing to do with cloud computing. The reason why it's called a point cloud is because our data is in fact very sparse. And by sparse, I mean if you go to the doctor and you get a CT scan or an MRI scan, and you do a volumetric reconstruction, for every single point in space, we have some piece of data. But we don't really want to do this for environments because most of our environment is air. Most of our environment we don't care about. And in fact, storing it just takes up a lot of space. So our idea is we're going to just store where the points are physically located. And because our scanner is just getting depth, our scanner can also get color images by generating a panorama at the same time it's generating this depth. So what we'll do is we'll take our color image, we'll take our depth image, we'll combine them together, and we can start to take people into virtual reality experiences that mimic the real world. So this technology actually has a long history. NASA used it way back in the 60s to try to generate terrain maps. This is technology that's used for autonomous vehicles. An example I like to point out to, because I just think it's so funny, is when I was in San Diego, I had a colleague, and what he did is he wanted to measure sea cliff erosion. So he took a LiDAR scanner, he had it on a wagon, and he wheeled it up and down the beach every week. And whenever there was a cave-in, he could actually know exactly how much of the sea cliff caved in. And this generated new hypotheses about how sand is generated. And this is also a technique that's used a lot in cultural heritage to try to store sites. And this was, again, kind of my background. So as a PhD student, I was super lucky. I got to go out to Florence, Italy for a month. I got to run around museums at night when they were closed and do 3D scanning and generate these different types of 3D models. So this was a super cool experience that I feel very fortunate to have been given. But another thing that happened when we were doing this was we got to explore other types of parts of this technology. So another example was in this museum, there was a room, and back in the 70s, the mafia had blown up a car bomb. And when the car bomb blew up, it actually shifted this building and caused this crack in the ceiling. And so the people who were responsible for this building were very interested in, okay, we have this crack. If it's stable, we don't want to touch it, right? We don't want to disturb this artwork. But if it's getting worse over time, we do want to fix it because we don't want to make this worse. And so what's really cool is that we could 3D scan up inside this crack and actually monitor it over time and let them know if it's getting worse or not. So coming way back to Wisconsin, so we're trying to figure out how to monitor homes and these real environments. And so based on this background and these experiences I had, the thought was, could we use the same technology that we use for cultural heritage, for all these different types of sites. Could we use these on homes? So could we 3D scan people's homes and generate a really accurate model of just a plain home environment? So the first project that we got to do this was called VisHome, and here's my very cliche of trying to describe it. So again, the home is kind of this black box for health. My silly example is, when you get up in the morning and you take your pills, do you take your pills in the kitchen or the bathroom or the living room? And is that because of your own opinion, or is that because of the environment? What is the interplay between these two things? So for this project, we went out, we captured 20 homes around Wisconsin. We brought these in. What was great with these is that these are not like 360 photographs. You can move to any spot in the home. You can look at them anywhere. We could bring in participants who were disabled and flash them through a bunch of homes really quickly and get their opinions and get their assessment on these different things. And the really cool byproduct, I think, of this project is all this is publicly available, and we have this time capsule of what a home looked like in 2014 and 2015. So normally you think about the things we capture with our phones or the things we think are interesting, right? Like this project's like capturing all the boring things. All the things that we wouldn't think about capturing are all inherent in these data sets. So a lot of our work originally was, how in the world do we try to render these data sets? Are really, really big. But you can start to see, like, this is, like this doesn't look like a normal computer-generated model. This is what these homes look like. And we can start to really explore the different areas of them, understand, like, what this environment is at a level that is really difficult and really different than, like, just having a 3D model to go through and model what the walls and floors and ceilings are. So what was cool with this was this kicked us off in a lot of different directions. So as we're doing this work, we teamed up with Epic, and we said, like, okay, could you use the same methodology before you're discharged? So could your doctor do like a virtual walkthrough of your home and point out all the things that might be problematic, tripping hazards and steps that maybe after your procedure you won't be able to do? A really unexpected one that came from this was that we're doing this, and there was a homicide north of Madison. And so the FBI called us up and said, could we do the same methodology on crime scene investigations? So I'll let this run in the background. This was a very slow news day. We were the top story at the 5 o'clock news, and we're not the top story by 6. So we did this 3D scan, crime scene. We brought the local FBI, we brought the sheriff into our virtual reality cave. We walked through the crime scene, and they said, this is amazing, right? Like, we can walk through the crime scene. We don't have to worry about contaminating it. We have all of this detail. We can remeasure anything we want. This is a really cool way of doing all this. So, right, we're researchers. Like, what do we do after this kind of experience? Well, we go and write a grant. So we wrote a grant to the Department of Justice. And what we realized is that while the investigators we worked with thought this was really cool and awesome, what we really needed to sell it to was their superiors. And so what we need to figure out is, what are the costs and benefits of doing this approach versus a standard approach? So we ended up creating different types of simulations. We have a website that you can plug in all of your data, because when we started doing this, we realized, we started presenting this, and they would have like small town police chief from little town Wisconsin would say, okay, you did this work in Madison, how does it relate to us? We'd have people from Chicago would say, we're from Chicago, how does this relate to us? So we create these different types of simulations where you could plug in the different variables of how much your scanning costs, how many different types of crimes you'd have per year, how much you pay your officers. And we found 2 major benefits of this approach. The first one comes from car crashes. And this one kind of makes sense. So in a car crash, this actually happened on 151, your goal is to get traffic moving as quickly as possible. So if you can do something to do a scan, to do investigations asynchronously and off-site, this is really beneficial. The second one that came up as a really big benefit of using 3D scanning technology were for homicides. So in homicide cases, the goal for the investigator is to collect everything, because the stakes are just so high that you don't know what might be important later on. And a lot of the investigators we talked to had these examples of a piece of evidence that at the time they were doing the initial data collection didn't seem that important, that later on actually had a huge impact in a case. other groups reached out to us. So we started working with the Taliesin Society and generated basically the highest resolution reconstruction of the Taliesin. We have different 3D reconstructions of spaces that public can't go to. We did a wine and cheese event where we had talks and had people go through and were able to see these different things. We started to try to collect data of different cultural heritage sites before they were taken down. And this work was really cool because we got on the front cover of Forum Journal for these efforts. We ended up working with the National Park Service, their shipwreck reconstruction team. So this is a different dive configurations, and we're working with them on like, what kind of cameras do you use, and where do you place cameras to optimally do 3D reconstructions so that you can take the most efficient dive paths and photographs to create reconstructions. And it was also pretty cool because then we teamed up with PBS Wisconsin and built some outreach activities with all of this. Also, as opposed to just like showing these environments, going back to that example of the crack, we realized like we could also do before and after scans. And where this became kind of interesting was if we did before and after scans, before home modifications to support aging in place. So we would go into someone's home the same way we did before and do these scans, and then we kind of monitor what they did. So we would actually look at different types of biometric signals, heart rate. We would have a camera and do kind of low resolution tracking. And what we found was that pre and post home modifications, that actually people did change the way that they moved around environments. We had some really preliminary evidence that it actually was reducing stress for people, which is really cool. This is a project that unfortunately COVID just took out. We were in the middle of a bunch of things and COVID came in and we just kind of couldn't finish it. But I'm gonna come back to this work at the end of the talk. So let me route back to this video of me in our cave system in this kitchen. So again, I'm moving stuff around. Now probably the fact that this looks like a cartoon kitchen isn't the first thing that jumps out to you, because the first thing that probably jumps out to you as being unrealistic is I normally don't pick up things by using a laser beam and skewering them and then whipping them around. And that was also for us what we kind of thought when we started this. It said, you know, if we really want to study people's behavior and action, we need to make something a little bit more realistic. And so when we started this, we started looking at things like EMG signals. So this, it looked, to the person who's in here, it looks like this is floating in their hand, but actually having people have to use the force that they would normally use on an object, so we could calibrate this all via virtual physics engines, and they can move stuff around. We ended up using this also for rehabilitation and other things. Started looking at like, okay, if you're gonna move virtual objects, how should you move them? What's the optimal way to do that, and creating guidelines for that. And then I'm gonna make, this doesn't really tie in anything, but I got really lucky. I got to work with some people in the theater department on making augmented reality theater productions in which we would actually have actors fly around the stage and automatic treadmills that would move them backwards. So this was just fun work I got to do earlier in my career. But tying back to this whole idea of, okay, if I want to take someone in virtual reality and I want to study their behavior and their decision-making process, I need to make sure that their actions and their perceptions all match what they do in the real world. And so we started looking at things like, okay, if we had a virtual cardboard box and a real cardboard box, how do people position where they think the corners are? How are their movements? And we looked at things like beanbag throwing. Okay, if I show you a virtual reality target and a real target, how is the difference if you're throwing or you're walking or you're pointing or how far away you tell us it is? And then we started looking at things like gait. So if we have a gait mat and you walk down a virtual hallway, a real hallway, how are these different? And worked with some colleagues in kinesiology who did this cool thing where they actually built a hallway in which you could change the width of the hall. So that the people didn't realize that the hallway width was changing. To look at gait, which is a thing that we can really easily do in virtual reality, where we can start to play with these different hallway widths. And what we started to find was that there are really interesting individual differences between people in virtual reality, where some people exhibit vast differences in their way they interact with the virtual world. Some people exhibit less. And we tried to figure out, is there a way that we can start to calibrate virtual environments to the individual user? And the high-level goal of this was to kind of think about virtual reality is a lot of times designed in a one-size-fits-all. Using a kind of silly example, right? Like this doesn't really work for clothes. You can find lots of examples. And the question then is, how do we start to tailor a virtual reality environment to a specific user? And what does that even mean? And I think what's kind of cool is, so Apple just released their crazy new headset. We were just talking before that we got it and are playing with it. But Apple also seems to be very interested in this. So you have to do a face scan before you buy one of these because they're trying to tailor the virtual reality environment to the user. So with all of that, I'll say, like, this is all still kind of stuff in the lab. How do we look at stuff kind of breaking beyond the lab? And one of the things that I was lucky enough to have is I had a PhD student who came from this whole background of kind of consumer science and design and was really interested in what does virtual reality do to consumer decision making? And so there's a lot of companies going out there, they're putting their virtual reality content on stores, and her findings were really interesting because what she started to see was that if you have virtual reality in a normal store with commodity goods, the VR environment actually isn't that informative, right? If you show somebody a box of virtual cereal and they have a real box of cereal, or if they're looking at a box of cereal online, it doesn't really change the way they approach this decision-making process. But where this does start to make an effect is if, imagine I'm looking at something like a hotel room. So if I look at hotel rooms on a website and I scroll through, what I end up looking at is I'll look at reviews, I'll look at the cost of it, and what often happens is I'm going to make a trade-off between what I see the cost is and what I see the potential value. And imagine that they have a hotel room that's really expensive, it's beachfront. I might look at that and say like, it's interesting, but the cost of it is just more than I want to spend. However, if you put me in VR and you showed me that value, right, suddenly I'm much more willing to do this. So this kind of inherently makes sense, right? All of a sudden you can show people the value of luxury goods, or you can imagine something that's called upselling. So I think it's a really interesting finding because a lot of times we're thinking about using VR to help people on these lower end purchases. But what she was showing is that it's actually these higher end purchases. It's actually these things that the value is hard to see where this becomes really important. Another area that we found a lot of benefit in is VR, AR for informal learning environments. So we've done a bunch of work. We're over at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, so there's lots and lots of outreach events. So we were partnering with those and developing informal learning scenarios for all kinds of different things. But one of the things that we realized was that we weren't really hitting the broad portions of the state. And in particular, we weren't hitting a lot of these rural communities. And these communities really, in a lot of ways, feel disconnected from UW-Madison, from the work here, from science content. And what's also interesting, my graphic here is a little bit dated, is that these communities are really shifting in terms of their demographics. And one of the big things we're starting to see is a big expanse of the Latinx community going into these rural communities. And so what we wanted to try to do, and this is a very weird collection of stakeholders for this project, is to try to reach these communities, the rural community, with particular emphasis on the Latinx community, by taking scientists of this ascent, working with library systems to build virtual reality experiences for polar research. So polar research is because this is the director of NSF we're working with, that they really care about this. But here's the fun part of polar research, right? In terms of science, like there's a lot of really, really cool science that happens in the poles. And so originally we had done a bunch of work trying to do informal learning experiences around the Ice Cube project. and building different experiences that would try to showcase not what this is, but what it's capable of, the passions of the scientists. And from that, our goal is for this project to build 5 different VR experiences around polar research. So our second one, which we've just completed, has to do with penguins. So our goal, we worked with an author who had written a book about her experiences watching penguins. So we built a VR experience called Waddle. And so in this virtual reality experience, you embody a penguin. You put on the virtual reality headset, you look down, you have flippers, you have waddle feet, and the way you move around is you waddle back and forth. And in this experience, you very briefly get to experience kind of the life cycle of a penguin. So you go in, you pick up rocks, you build a nest, you find a mate, you do a mating dance, you try to protect your egg from skua attacks. So some really early findings that we've gotten from this is that in terms of informal learning, this is actually really good. So we do see gains in learning, but the really interesting thing we started to find is we started to look at empathy. And that this experience of embodying a penguin significantly increases people's empathy around penguins. And that we also see a correlation between the empathy that someone has about penguins and how embodied they feel in a penguin. So this kind of makes sense, but it's a really interesting finding when you start to think about different types of informal learning and different things we could leverage, because this goal of trying to have someone embody a different character or a different being can start to increase empathy and start to increase learning. For this project, we've been working with librarians. So we've had different cohorts of librarians that we brought in. What's been fun is that we've had the libraries send things out to Antarctica, and then they send it back, and they bring in their library. For this penguin event, for scenario, they've run different types of events. You can see like they've put penguins out in front of the libraries or had different activities. And we've learned a lot, I would say, thus far. We're about 2 years into this 5-year project about libraries working with VR. The libraries we work with are all over the spectrum in terms of how big they are. Some libraries are basically the size of this room. Some libraries have multiple floors and lots of technology and different things. We've also learned a lot about having librarians work with the Latinx community. In particular, like sometimes the best way to try to connect with communities is to just get out of the libraries. And we found actually that going to restaurants and other types of community events and schools is the best way to connect with people. But we have, as weird as all these connection points are, we have actually seen these things all connect together and had people come in and really feel this experience of using VR, that they wouldn't normally get to get these new experiences and understand the library and these connection points. So we feel like we've made some really good headway on trying to connect with these different groups. If you're interested to try this out, this experience is totally free. It is on the Meta App Lab. It's also on SideQuest, so you can download it and try it out. Another thing that we're doing currently is that we are recording every single thing anyone does in a virtual experience. And this is also data that is publicly available. It doesn't come out till the next month to kind of try to help. And it goes through like an anonymization process. But it's been really interesting. So currently we're working to take these data logs and to try to run them through machine learning to predict things like early quitting, frustration, simulator sickness maybe. So this has been, I think, a really interesting data source that we're getting that we're just starting to explore in terms of what can we do to try to make online predictors. So you can imagine if someone in a virtual experience, if we could have an online predictor to detect that they're getting frustrated, we could start to design interventions in real time. And we're about to release our next VR scenario. So this one is going to be pretty fun. You're going to be a Latinx scientist out in the poles, and your job is to fix weather stations. This is something that people actually do in Antarctica. It is a pretty crazy job, as all Antarctic research is. And so we're going to make this kind of fun and silly. For those who are familiar with Job Simulator, that's kind of what it's inspired by. But this will be coming out in the next couple months. And we're really curious to explore the impact of all this work. A more formal learning thing that we're working on is working with the U.S. Forestry Service on trying to make training modules for them. So we've had people go out in the field and collect different types of data in terms of they're really interested in logs. So we're creating virtual logs and virtual forests. So this is just kind of a bunch of different views of this, but trying to train them in terms of how to analyze these different types of logs that were cut down in terms of these measurement processes. And their current mode of training people is with a video. So the idea is that we can start to design assessments and help people be much more ready to go out in the field before they do. Another project, and I don't have too many slides on this, but it's kind of fun, is we have been working with a project on AR and first responders, so particularly SWAT teams and firefighters, and trying to design ways that we can better support them in the field. So we've been using a lot of computer vision and machine learning to try to help identify things and building real-time maps so that off-site commanders can understand where everyone is positioned. It can build a real-time map, so as they're moving through, it shows the map that where everyone's at. They can start to tag things. They can label safe routes, exit routes, triage points. So this has been it's a lot of systems work, but really kind of fun and informative. We've also been working with American Family Insurance on doing insurance documentation. So can you take your phone, walk around a car, have it document all the different features? We've been looking at things like, can we predict damage, hail detection, those type of things. But, excuse me, I started with health in the home. I thought the last project I would kind of dive into at all in some detail would just be back to this whole idea of health in the home. And I just want to highlight kind of the problem that we currently have in this country, which is growing. So currently, in this country, we have 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day. So we have this just kind of massive aging population. In fact, when you look at it, by 2038, over a third of the population will be over 65 and over 10% will be over 80. And when we look at this, by 2035, 40% of households will have a person with a disability. To add to this, we have more and more people who are living alone. And the problem we have in this country is our homes are just not built to support this. And there's lots of reasons why, but a lot of homes are just not really built with this in mind. So, I talked about previously in this talk, we've done this work where we've tried to use VR to study the environment itself, to study people's decisions. We've done this work to try to study the impact of home modifications. But how do we assess the home itself? And the answer, what we normally do right now, is kind of surprisingly convoluted. So what we normally do, if you want to do a home assessment, is you send out somebody who's highly trained. This is generally an occupational therapist, and this occupational therapist has been trained to do home assessments. And what they do is they complete this huge form. And having done this form, it is really hard to do. It's really time-consuming. And so what this means is that only a limited number of people can do this home assessment. The person who does this home assessment needs to actually go to the home itself, so they have to drive there. Then they have to do this whole process that's really time-consuming. And what this all means is that this is a pretty expensive process, right? Like, you have a highly trained person, there's not many of them, they have to come on site. So this costs a good amount of money. And what does this mean? This means that this is totally inaccessible to huge swaths of the population. There's just no way you can get a home assessment. There's no way you can find out if your home meets qualifications. So a group of us said, look, can we use technology to really help solve this problem? So we developed an interdisciplinary team. So we have people from occupational therapy, design, computer science. And our goal was, okay, could we develop a mobile app that can go and walk people through this process and help them with the scoring? It could skip different things that they don't need to do. It could put things in the right units. They could take photos, and it could generate reports for them. And as we did this, we got to thinking, could we use mobile-based AR to help with this problem? Now, mobile-based AR is kind of a lot of times gimmicky, I'm going to say. Right? It's oftentimes this thing of can you put some furniture in this room, and if you move around, it doesn't really stay put, and it doesn't really, it's kind of cool, but it doesn't really seem to help you with anything. But we got really excited a couple years ago because Apple started throwing LiDAR sensors on their phones. So all of a sudden you have the capability of having accurate measurements from your phone. And so we started to build tools. I'm just going to show a couple of them in this background. They're going to just fly through. But so could we start to build tools that aid in this assessment process and start to show people things like height ranges or areas or do measurements for you to help people through this assessment process? And right, because we're researchers, we did studies comparing the traditional way of doing this and the AR measurement way of doing this. And what we found is AR way faster. Almost across the board, this was a much faster way of gathering data. The data itself ended up many times being more accurate from an AR measurement point of view, which was surprising to us. We were just trying to aim for equal. When we asked people which one of these is easier to use, AR generally came out on top. And we said, okay, you got a measurement. Are you more confident in the one that you got from the AR app? Or are you more confident from the one from kind of a traditional measure? People tended to lean toward this AR measurement. And so I think there's a really, really strong potential for this, that the type of measurements that we do and assessments that we do, that I think technology can really, really tie into this. And so we've been building more tools, measuring staircases and walk distances and all kinds of things. And what I'm excited about is this new wacky Apple headset that we just got that costs a fortune. But you can imagine that all of a sudden while you're walking through places, it can start to do these assessments for you and aid you in this process. And all of a sudden we can lower this barrier from having a couple highly trained individuals and having it cost a fortune to go out and do this, to making it hopefully to the point where it's like anyone could go through and do these assessment processes and understand what they need to do for their home. So that's, I think, a big goal of ours. We have a lot of work going into this, and I'm pretty excited where it's going. I thought I'd briefly just talk about a couple other things in this field that are not my work, but if you're interested in where this is going and kind of other parts of this field might be useful just to hear about. So machine learning everywhere, right? Machine learning is in everything. How does machine learning touch into some of the topics I've talked about today? And there's two kind of major things out there that have sparked people's interest, let's say. So the first one is this thing called NERF. So these are neural radiance fields. And so here's the concept of these things. So imagine I have an object and I take photographs all around it. And my goal is that I want to now position a camera in some arbitrary space and get an image back. So the goal of this work is, or I guess the way that this work is positioned is, so I'm going to take a photograph with a known position and orientation, and I'm going to send all these photographs through a machine learning algorithm. And what I want on the other side that I'm going to try to optimize for is that I can choose a position in space, and I say, give me back the color and the density. So how likely there's something there. And the results of this, so this is now a couple years old, are pretty interesting. So you can start to see, like for this Christmas tree, like you start to get this detail that's up inside of there. This is from the original paper. So you can also do things where you can combine images from different time periods and times of days, and it will kind of do these blurs between them. You can also go through these and extract full 3D models. They're not necessarily the most high resolution, but you can start to do things like relighting or shading or those kind of things. So I bring this up because this is actually really different than basically everything else we do in this field. And the reason why is normally when we want to try to have a 3D model, we have some implicit representation of a 3D space. So maybe our model is a bunch of triangles, maybe it's a bunch of points, maybe it's a bunch of voxels. But we have a representation of our data in 3D. So what's really weird with this approach is that we don't. In this approach, we just have a machine learned brain. And that machine learned brain can go and theoretically recreate the 3D structure of our environment. So as opposed to me sending you a data model, I send you a brain and you use that to reconstruct an image of that. So you start to think about, this is kind of weird, right? This would be like, as opposed to sending you a paper, I send you a machine learned brain that can recreate that paper. So this is really different. I think we're all trying to get our head wrapped around what exactly this means, and especially for things like crime scene investigation. Is this more reliable, less reliable? It's an open question. The other one, this just came out this fall. It's got a lot of people really excited. So I thought it might be worth just mentioning for people who are interested in this type of field. So this is called 3D Gaussian splatting. And the concept here is, sometimes people conflate this with NERF. It's different though. So here's our concept. We have this thing that's a splat. So it's basically dark in the middle, and it's a Gaussian function, so it falls off toward the edges. So this has got a circle around it just so you can kind of see where it's at, but it would theoretically fade out to nothing. So here are the different attributes we're going to try to optimize. So a splat can have a 3D position. It can have a covariance, so this is basically its orientation and scaling. The splat can have a different color. So here it could be yellow or it could be purple. And it can also have a different alpha, so how opaque it is. So these are the different parameters we're going to try to optimize on. And what we're going to do is that we're going to combine a bunch of these little splat things together, and this is going to now use this to try to generate an image. So this process actually looks very similar to photogrammetry. This is the work that we did with the Park Service. So you take a bunch of photographs of things, and then you run structure from motion, and you get kind of this very low resolution point cloud. So this is all kind of standard how you do this in photogrammetry, but now you're going to do something really different. So now what we're going to do is that we're going to hand this process off to a machine learning algorithm, and we say, okay, figure out the optimal splat parameters to generate an image that when I go back to my photograph, it looks correct. And the results are pretty spectacular. So this is 7 million splats, and it actually reconstructs things like the spokes of the tires for the bike. So I'll just put kind of, you can see how this works. This is from their paper. So you can start to see like it's optimizing these splats, and it's trying to figure out its 3D models. This isn't quite as weird to think about handing someone a 3D model, but again, your 3D model isn't necessarily the geometry of this thing anymore. It's a bunch of splats that you can use to reconstruct how this looks. But the results of this, again, people are very excited about because it will come up in a second, can start to reconstruct real life environments that look very realistic. So here's this kind of playroom example. And so this is just a bunch of these little splat things all composited together, and it gives you this result that looks very realistic. So yeah, here's another example of this. So this is just came out in August. People are very excited about it. I think this kind of shows, like in all fields, right? AI and machine learning are having a transformational effect, and I think we're all trying to understand what exactly they're going to do to the different parts of fields. So with all that, I'm going to conclude my talk just with a couple last points, and then I'll be open up for questions. So if we go back to the 1950s, this is what a computer looked like, right? And the thing in the 1950s computers is that they were big and they were expensive, but mostly they were exclusive. Not many people got to use a computer. If you're using a computer, you better be doing science or something because it costs a lot of money to build it. And so you better be doing things that show the value of that expense. And I think something really interesting happened when we went from computers like this to computers that were people's personal computers. And all of a sudden you lowered that barrier, and all of a sudden you really spurred innovation. And I think in the field of VR, we've seen something very similar today. So in the 1980s, again, VR, very expensive, cost prohibitive. Right now these devices, $500. Some of the lower end ones, $300. So all of a sudden now you can start to innovate. You can start to explore the field and not worry about the fact that you have this huge upfront cost that was needed to try to generate these things. And I think something similar is also happening for 3D scanning. So the 3D scanners I used when I was a graduate student cost over $100,000. The ones that we used here at Wisconsin cost $30,000. Right now, all of a sudden, you've got on your phone, theoretically, 3D scanning capabilities. This is just with us, right? And so this starts to open up these doors. And AI is, without a doubt, also changing things. So there's things out there in which you don't need to be a 3D modeler. You just type in what you want it to generate, and it will generate a 3D model for you. I think this is really, really powerful. And so going back to kind of my opening slide of this idea of like a digital world and a physical world, I think we're starting to really see where these worlds are going to start to connect and really create powerful opportunities for the future. So I always like to say, I think it's just really exciting times for this field I'm in. I'm really excited to be part of it. Here's my slide of all the different people who have funded me and partners and external partners. So I think with that, I will close up and just say thank you so much for coming to this talk today. I'm happy to answer any questions and talk to you also individually afterwards if you have really specific questions about my work. Yeah.
Have you ever had any attempts on 3D reconstruction of dynamic scenes?
Yeah.
Right now, I see you have 3D reconstruction for the environment. But what about the human subject itself?
Yeah.
Especially when I'm thinking about this from occupational economics point. Like if our subject itself is doing performing some certain activities that interact with the environment.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the one that we're currently doing this on is, so for the penguin experience, we actually are recording everything the person is doing. So their movements, their head movements, and then that's getting logged. And then what we're doing is we're recreating that log and recreating their playback. So the process of what we're going to try to do is take their actions, it goes out to this log, we take the log, reconstruct, because we have the 3D scene, we can reconstruct basically a video replay without ever having a video. Take those videos, run those through human coders, and then have those human coders code the things, with the goal being that then we could take that original movement data and run that through machine learning algorithms based on the classifications we got from people watching the video, to try to generate classifications of the actual dynamic parts of the scene. So that's our goal in all of that. Other places that we have done dynamic recording of participants, so for the gait data, we really wanted to look at how people walked. I didn't talk about this project that much. Our goal of this project is to try to do fall detection. So one of the things that happens is that for older adults, falling isn't necessarily the fact that they can't walk. It's that they're walking and then there's the distractors. So they're walking, the phone rings, they try to turn and get it, and then that's where they fall. And so it's basically, or they're holding something. It's when they're doing multiple things at once. So we want to try to recreate those type of situations. And so we've been using a gait map, but also high-speed cameras to try to collect basically their body positions, all their movement data, to try to inspect that. So those are the two areas in terms of like the human aspect. I guess I have a third one too. In terms of the augmented reality theater productions, we were using, this is older work, we were using Connect 2 systems and set up an array of those. So there, what we had been doing, I wish I actually had the video of this, is that when the person would move around, we'd have like an automatic treadmill. So as they would walk on the treadmill, it would detect their speed, and it would automatically, they could walk or run, it would automatically keep pushing them back at the right speed. They could also then move around the stage, and we had a hoist, so it would follow their movement around the stage, and then they could trigger it, and it would actually fly them up in the air. So it was that type of 3D tracking that we were using. Now, Connect 2 is not the most accurate system in the world, but it was accurate enough for that project. One other thing I'll say for time-varying data sets is a long time ago we were doing some work just looking at how to visualize things like fluid simulations and those type of things, which are a little bit different than your question on humans. And so we're creating different ways to try to optimize and visualize those that I'm happy to show. It's interesting, currently we don't have as much except for this predictive model in terms of human subjects, 3D, but we've done a bit of it. And if you wanted to look at an environment changing over time, the biggest thing is just a lot of these 3D scanning processes assume a static environment. So you just scan it over and over again. We've done it a little bit with shipwrecks. But if you had somebody moving in space, now you need something to try to reconstruct what their position is or run it through AI or something like that. So, yeah.
So I'm just kind of more curious about the implementation of
Yeah.
these different systems. So for the aging at home
Yeah.
and on augmented reality, I'm curious, like, who are you using to base those results off of AR is easier?
Yeah, good question. Very good question. So that one, the preliminary data is from just people on campus. So this ends up not being older adults. We are running studies where we're actually sending phones out to both older adults and occupational therapists, but we're not necessarily doing that comparison study between like measure and now use this app.
Yeah.
Those thus far have been more of usability studies in terms of like what works for them, what doesn't work for them. One of the things that's a little bit tricky in this process, this is pushback I've gotten from reviewers too, is what's a little interesting is our target benefactor of the research are older adults. The primary user of our tools may not be that same benefactor. It may be their kids or an occupational therapist. It's somewhere along that range. So we've been working with occupational therapists to get their feedback. We've been working with different groups in terms of some of these older adults. But the data for that study came from just people on campus.
Yeah, I'm curious why you decided to leave out the comparison between the original and for like the actual occupational therapist that would be.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, why didn't we?
Because like if you're using people on campus, they're probably more technology.
Yes.
They're also probably higher well educated, more recently being educated.
Yes.
So it's totally different in terms of how they might perceive something being different.
Yep.
And then in a similar vein, like talking about the police departments, I'm curious like how when you're using those crime investigations, when they're using them, is there like an additional, like how many different softwares do they have to need? How are they storing this data? How trained do they have to be to use it? Especially for like small town cops, like that is, heavy barriers.
Yes.
To implementation of these resources. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So that one I can talk a little bit about because that one gets really interesting. Let me give you another big challenge. So when we started this project, we're working with crime scene investigators. The people we were working with were pretty tech savvy and love technology. Their supervisor very much was in the mindset, we've always done it this other way. It always worked. Why are we changing anything? And I would say that pushback was so strong throughout this process. Is that the higher ups did not see the value of new technology because it's always worked this other way, we've done it before. Why are we changing anything? And so that was a constant pushback. Another one that we didn't expect is courtrooms are incredibly low tech. Like courtrooms do not have good technology. So, and then the other thing that we knew was going to happen and did is defense attorneys also pushing back on technology and saying, how in the world do we know this is reliable? What is this? So we had examples of where people successfully worked through that process. In terms of the scanning technology, so the Dane County Sheriff's Office, who we were primarily working with, got very excited about this. They bought their own handheld scanner that they then used in courtrooms. And then we worked with Fox Valley Technical College. They've got this just insane mock crime scene town. It's got a gas station and a hotel, and they run SWAT and firefighter operations. And so they also had lots of examples of people trying to use this throughout the whole criminal justice process, and sometimes where it was incredibly beneficial. So a very weird example of 3D scanning being useful, but wouldn't happen all the time is they had this example. I'm trying to recreate this whole thing. So it was a bridge. They had a person who jumped out and shot some people. So they're on this bridge. They're trying to do their crime scene investigation. A huge storm's coming in. So the problem is that all the evidence is going to be destroyed. So they need to try to collect all this evidence as fast as possible so they can try to do some of this investigation basically asynchronously. But yeah, in terms of the difficulty to use and the benefits, I think it's one of those things that, like, in the process, it is the higher up level that you need to sell this to. And as the technology gets better, like, there were also discussions that we didn't get into. So we worked with, we had focus groups of judges and lawyers and law enforcement officials. And there's lots of opportunities. So like they talked about, like, it would be really awesome if you could take your jury, virtually take them to the crime scene as opposed to driving them in buses there, because boy, is that a hard logistical task. But then how do you ensure that everybody sees the same thing, right? So for everything, there's like this weird trade-off. And I think the goal of our work is to try to help people, motivate them and say, like, there are huge benefits to this, but it needs to be so super easy, I think, to part of your point, that it just like works. Like requires almost no extra effort, just works out of the box. And so some of those challenges, I think. Right, and that's the other thing, right, for general public. So that was another, I mean, I could talk a lot about this project. That was another area where people were concerned, is that they didn't want it to look like a video game. If it looked like a video game, then it would look made up. So how do you try to convey that this is the real scene and that this is what's really going on? And I think that's, part of that is between the investigators, the prosecutors, but like you said, the jury, and what is the trust of this? And, now as we get AI that can just generate all this stuff, I think that's going to be a huge question too, of, how reliable are these 3D models that are being generated?
We'll have the final question for
Yeah.
Karen, nice to meet you. I'm a faculty here. I just came from Texas A&M, where we have worked with several AR, VR projects, particularly with first responders.
Oh, nice.
So all the stuff that you were talking about, the challenges with integration is real. I think the question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is the quality of the research space around? Yeah, we can create all of these really cool realism, fitted environments, but what is the experience of the individual from a micro level in terms of cognition, in terms of movement? You're talking about being in a VR and you're walking in the same spot. That's not the same as embodied cognition, where you're walking around the room and you're using the spatial information, not just from the visual perspective, but from, just where you are in space. And so I think the challenge is not just at the higher ups, because we've seen that with NFPA too. They do not want trainings with VR, because they say, we play with fire. Why do you want us to play with toys? Right. However real things are. So, but what we've also seen is the challenge at the user level, because they don't take in information the way they take in information in a real setting. So how do we bridge that gap? I wanted to get your feedback.
Yeah, I think so. What I'm very excited about is the current push of more mixed reality systems. So I was saying, so the Quest 3, I feel like is a much better device than the Quest 2 and the new Apple headset. So they both, you put them on, and it's, again, they're video cameras, but you see the real world. And the first responders we're working with, it's a HoloLens, so you actually see the real world with your normal eyes, and it just superimposes content. So once you have that, I think you start to break out of that a little bit, because you're interfacing with your real world, you're walking around the real world, and we're just trying to superimpose content. And so I think that starts to help a little bit compared to a pure virtual reality setting in which I need some way to locomote myself in VR, Is this, like you said, walking in place or a treadmill? Now you could try to create physical environments that model this. But now you're trying to just augment them a little bit. And I think that's a lot easier sell. I think it's also a lot easier, for someone to jump into, and you don't feel like I'm disconnected from the world because I can still see the world. So that to me is a little bit where I'm more excited, is that these mixed reality systems in which I still am in my normal world, but I'm just superimposing content and adding content, and I can gesture and move around normally, but I can augment it a little bit so that the VR aspect is maybe downplayed a little bit.
Yeah, I think the training application is a better sell than a fielded application, particularly
Yeah.
first response, because we've seen a big pushback with these systems being fielded applications rather than training tools.
Yeah, and in that one, I would say the majority of our work is actually just how do we is more of a mapping thing. So the augmented reality is giving some people feedback, but it's more of this off-site commander to know where everyone's at and to try to label things. So, but there's lots of issues. Like, here's one of the big issues is, so HoloLens, really small field of view in terms of what the VR content. So that's weird. You do get a little, while you're using your normal eyes, there is a weird little bit of rainbowing effect. And everything you do with first responders, it's got to be works out of the box, super dumb. There's no way they're doing a hand gesture in the middle of a SWAT operation trying to like pull up a map, right? So I think that's another really interesting, if you look at what Apple and Meta are doing, it's a lot of these like hand interaction gestures. It's super cool to watch, but like that is not going to be a feasible thing for a SWAT person. And then the other big challenge we've had is for firefighters if you have a huge smoky environment. So these systems do inside-out tracking, so they use cameras to figure out where they're at in space. Well, if your whole environment's smoke, they have no idea where they're at. So that's also been a big challenge we're trying to work through.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.